The small grocery store was unusually quiet that morning. Most of the shelves were neatly stocked, and the fresh produce in the corner glistened under the soft lighting. It was one of those places where the sound of the cash register beeping and the clink of coins was enough to fill the air. People came in to grab a few items, the kind of store where everyone knew each other by face, if not by name. It was an ordinary day like any other, until a moment of unexpected tension arrived. An elderly woman, walking with the help of a cane, shuffled her way down the narrow aisles of the store. She wasn't in a rush, taking her time as she carefully selected what she needed. It was clear she was on a fixed budget, looking at price tags with a practiced eye. She grabbed a loaf of bread, a few cans of soup, some fruit, and a small carton of milk. Her shopping list wasn't long, but the items she picked were necessities, no treats or luxury items. She was a woman who knew exactly what she needed. She moved slowly, her pace matching her age. Her silver hair was neatly tucked into a soft bun, and she wore a simple cardigan and a scarf, as though she was accustomed to the chill in the air. She seemed content enough, though perhaps a little lonely. Her eyes would occasionally glance around, as if looking for a familiar face, but mostly, she kept to herself. When she finally made her way to the checkout, the young cashier barely looked up from the register as he started scanning the items. He was in his early 20s, clearly distracted by his phone, which was sitting just out of sight on the counter. He had the look of someone who had seen too many customers and didn't really care anymore. His uniform was a little wrinkled, and he moved through the motions of ringing up groceries without much thought. The old woman placed her basket down, carefully pulling her purse onto the counter. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, searching through the contents of the bag looking for something. Then, after a moment of digging, she pulled out a small leather pouch, the kind that had seen better days. She opened it gently, revealing a small collection of loose coins. She began to count them out one by one, placing them carefully on the counter. The cashier, Ben, glanced over at her briefly. He could tell from the way she was counting that she was using coins instead of bills. He sighed loudly, making sure she heard it. It wasn't that he had a problem with the elderly or with coins, but it was the inconvenience of it all. Coins were always harder to count, and it took longer. It was annoying. He wasn't particularly busy, but he hated that feeling of wasted time. "Are you sure you don't want to just use a card?" he asked a little too loudly. "I mean, it's 2023, you know? People don't really carry cash these days." He wasn't trying to be rude, or maybe he was, but it came out that way anyway. Ben didn't like the hassle of counting out change, especially when people didn't seem to get it. The old woman didn't answer. She just continued counting the coins, moving at her own pace. Ben let out another sigh and rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath. "Guess I'm the one stuck here waiting while you try to find all those pennies." His voice wasn't quiet. He wanted her to hear it, to feel the pressure of his frustration. There were a couple of other people in line behind her now, but they were staying quiet, not wanting to get involved. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry these days, and no one wanted to stand up to the cashier, especially when it was clear that he didn't care. The elderly woman didn't seem bothered by his comments, though. She kept her focus on the coins, lining them up one by one. She had done this before, and she wasn't in any rush. There was something almost peaceful about her movements, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to come with age. Maybe it was that feeling of not needing to rush, of having time on her side. Or maybe it was just that she had heard similar comments before and had learned to ignore them. Either way, she kept going. Ben, on the other hand, was growing more impatient. He watched as she placed the last coin down, counting it carefully. The line behind her was growing, and he could feel the eyes of the other customers on him. He was already running late for his break, and the idea of standing there for even another minute was enough to make him grumble. He glanced at the other people in line, looking for some kind of support, but they just shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Eyes down, pretending not to notice, Ben took the opportunity to speak up again, though this time his words were sharper. "Come on, seriously," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Do you need help counting those? Or are you just stuck in the past?" There it was. He couldn't stop himself now. It was a cheap shot, and it wasn't even clever, but it felt good in the moment. He hated feeling like his time was being wasted, and there she was taking so long with her old coins. Maybe it wasn't just about the coins, but about everything, about people like her who seemed so out of touch with how things were now. The old woman didn't respond. She just looked up at him, her eyes calm and steady, though there was a slight flicker of something in them. Maybe it was surprise or maybe just resignation. But she didn't say anything. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging his words without giving him the satisfaction of a real response. Behind her, a man in a dark hoodie stood waiting. He had been standing there quietly for a while, looking around the store, almost blending in with the background. He was tall with dark hair, but it was hard to say anything more about him at first glance. He seemed like just another customer, no one remarkable, no one who would make any noise or stir up trouble. But as he watched the exchange between the old woman and Ben, something inside him shifted. The young cashier's behavior was bothering him more than he expected. It wasn't just the rudeness. It was the way he seemed to think it was okay to treat someone like that just because they were a little different. The man in the hoodie shifted his weight from one foot to the other, watching Ben and the old woman. He could feel the tension in the air, but no one else seemed to be saying anything. The line had grown longer, and everyone was just waiting, hoping it would end soon. Finally, the old woman finished counting the last of her coins and pushed them across the counter. She didn't look up at Ben, and she didn't say anything more. She just waited for him to finish. The man in the hoodie, though, was starting to feel uncomfortable. He couldn't understand how someone could be so unkind to an elderly woman, especially when she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just trying to pay for her groceries in the best way she could. Ben, now clearly annoyed, began to ring up the last few items. He was almost done, but he couldn't stop himself from making one last jab. "Guess I'll just have to keep dealing with people who don't know how to use modern payment methods," he said, glancing at the woman with a forced smile. It was the final straw for the man in the hoodie. He couldn't let it go anymore. With a deep breath, he took a small step forward, just enough for the old woman to notice him. He was ready to speak up, but he didn't want to make a scene. He just wanted to do the right thing. Ben finished ringing up the last of the groceries, tapping the buttons of the cash register with a mechanical rhythm. The beep of each item was followed by a soft rustling as he gathered the coins the old woman had painstakingly counted. There were a few moments of silence, the kind that only come after an uncomfortable exchange, as the coins clinked one by one. Ben could feel the tension in the air, but he tried to brush it off. After all, it wasn't a big deal, right? He'd had worse customers, but something gnawed at the back of his mind, something he couldn't shake. The man in the hoodie, who had been standing quietly behind the old woman, shifted his weight. His eyes were fixed on the exchange, but he didn't say anything. He had his hands in his pockets, but his posture had changed. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt as though the store had gone silent. Everyone else in line seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. There was a strange energy in the air, as if the moment was building to something that no one could predict. The old woman hadn't said much since Ben's last comment. She had remained calm, though her movements were slow and deliberate. When the last of her coins was taken, she took a deep breath and reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the worn leather as she tried to gather the few crumpled bills she had left. "Is that everything?" Ben asked, his tone still edged with frustration. He had been trained to ask customers this question, but it felt more like an excuse to break the tension than anything else. His voice was flat, and he didn't look up as he began to push the receipt toward her. The old woman nodded quietly. She placed a crumpled dollar bill on the counter, her hands trembling just a little. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. There was a moment where she hesitated, looking up at Ben for just a second, and then she slowly gathered the rest of her things. She hadn't said much, but the quiet dignity in her actions was hard to ignore. Ben took the bill and gave her the change, the coins clinking in his hand as he pushed them toward her. As he did, he let out a soft sigh, more of a reflex than anything else. He couldn't help himself. It had been a long morning, and the weight of everything was beginning to settle on his shoulders. But when he looked up, the elderly woman wasn't looking at him. Instead, her eyes were focused on the man in the hoodie, who had shifted a little closer to the counter. The man had been quiet up until now, but something about the way the old woman had stood there, so composed in the face of Ben's attitude, seemed to stir something inside him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just about the coins. It was about how people like her were treated. He had seen it before. People who were ignored or treated as less than because they didn't fit the mold of what others expected. "Hey," the man in the hoodie said, his voice steady but calm. It wasn't loud or forceful, but there was a weight to it. You don't have to talk to her like that. Ben blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected words. He hadn't been paying attention to the man behind him at all, but now, with the remark hanging in the air, he felt a flush creeping up his neck. He didn't know who this guy was, but the sudden confrontation felt like a shift in the atmosphere. The other customers in line started shifting a little, not daring to say anything, but clearly curious about what would happen next. "What's your problem?" Ben asked, his words sharp. He turned slightly toward the man in the hoodie, trying to brush off the tension that had started to hang between them. "It's just coins. She's taking forever with them. People don't have time for this." The man in the hoodie didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on Ben, unwavering, his posture still relaxed but firm. "That's not the point," he said, his voice quieter but no less clear. "The point is, you don't treat people like that. You don't get to make someone feel small just because you're in a hurry." Ben opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time that day, the words seemed to stick in his throat. It wasn't that he didn't have a response ready. It was that the man's words had hit him in a way he wasn't prepared for. There was something about the calmness in his voice, the simple truth of what he had said, that made Ben pause. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ben could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, the weight of their silent judgment pressing in. He looked back at the old woman, still standing quietly at the counter, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes weren't angry or hurt, they were just tired, as if she had seen this all before. The man in the hoodie, still watching Ben, spoke again, but this time, his tone was softer, almost like he was speaking to the whole store. "Everyone deserves respect. Not just the people you think are important. Not just the ones who can pay the fastest or buy the most expensive things." He glanced over at the old woman again. "This woman here is just as important as anyone else. Don't make her feel less than that." Ben shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't that he didn't know what the man was saying was true. It was more that he had never really thought about it like that before. He had been so caught up in his own frustration that he hadn't stopped to think about how his actions might affect someone else. And now, with the quiet of the store pressing in on him, he realized just how thoughtless he had been. The man in the hoodie stepped forward a little, just enough to close the space between him and the counter. He glanced at the old woman, his face softening. "You don't have to worry about it," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll cover the rest of your groceries." The old woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to people offering to help her like this, especially not in the middle of an uncomfortable situation. She had never expected a stranger to step in, especially after the way Ben had treated her. But there was something about the way the man in the hoodie spoke that made her feel seen. She nodded slowly, her hand still resting on the counter as she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Ben, for his part, had gone completely still. He had no idea what to do with himself now. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not by a complete stranger, and certainly not in front of a customer he had just mistreated. The man in the hoodie pulled out his wallet and placed a few bills on the counter, just enough to cover the old woman's groceries. He didn't look at Ben, didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked toward the door, nodding at the woman as he passed. "Take care," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight of meaning that Ben couldn't ignore. The old woman watched him go, still processing what had just happened. She had been so focused on the task at hand that she hadn't noticed the way the other customers in line were looking at her. Now, as the man walked out of the store, she felt a strange sense of warmth in her chest. Ben, meanwhile, stood frozen at the counter, unsure of what had just transpired. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just slipped through his fingers, something he couldn't take back. The store was silent for a moment, and then the sound of the cash register started up again, breaking the stillness. Ben glanced at the old woman who had started to gather her things. She was moving a little faster now, as if the tension had been lifted, and she no longer felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. As she left the store, Ben stood there staring at the counter, his mind racing. He didn't know who the man in the hoodie was or why he had chosen that moment to step in, but he did know one thing: the day had changed, and he wasn't sure if he could ever go back to seeing things the way he had before. The bell above the door jingled softly as the old woman stepped out of the store, her feet moving at a slow, steady pace. The warmth of the sunlight felt good on her face, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, she felt a little lighter. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, how the man in the hoodie had stepped in to help or why Ben's attitude had changed, but she knew something had shifted. She had been on the receiving end of unkindness many times before, but this was different. This time someone had stood up for her, and that felt like something worth holding on to. Outside, the street was buzzing with the usual activity. People were walking by, some hurrying, others taking their time, lost in their own thoughts. The old woman walked a little faster now, the weight of the day lifting with each step. Her groceries, once a burden, felt lighter in her arms. There was something about the air that day, something fresh and full of promise. She hadn't expected to leave the store feeling like this, but now, she couldn't help but smile to herself. Meanwhile, inside the store, Ben stood frozen behind the counter. The man in the hoodie had left, and so had the silence he'd brought with him. Ben wasn't sure what had just happened, but something about the whole situation felt off. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, the words the man had said echoing in his thoughts. He had never really thought about it that way before. He had always seen people who took too long at the register as an inconvenience. It was part of his job, he told himself. Customers were in a rush and he had a schedule to keep. But the words the man had said about respect, about not making people feel small, had hit him hard. It wasn't just about the coins. It was about the way he had treated her, and suddenly he didn't feel so proud of himself. Ben glanced over at the cash register, where the old woman's receipt still lay, her change sitting in a neat pile next to it. It felt wrong to just leave it there. He had barely taken a moment to think about her as a person, someone with her own life, her own struggles. In his frustration, he had reduced her to nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be dealt with. He reached for the receipt, his fingers brushing the paper as he let out a slow breath. He didn't know why, but something about the whole situation was eating at him. He had been rude, impatient, and thoughtless. He had seen people like her before, the elderly, the ones who struggled to keep up with the fast-paced world around them, and he had never really stopped to think about what it must feel like for them. As he stood there, lost in thought, the store manager, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, came over to the counter. She had been watching the exchange between Ben and the old woman from the back of the store, and she could tell that something was off. "Everything all right?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. Ben glanced up at her, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, he said, his voice trailing off. He didn't sound sure of himself. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. The words the man in the hoodie had said kept replaying in his mind over and over again. I think I messed up." The manager raised an eyebrow, stepping closer to the counter. "What do you mean?" Ben looked down at the receipt in his hand, still trying to process what had happened. "I shouldn't have treated her like that. She was just trying to pay for her groceries, and I made her feel like she was a burden. I shouldn't have said what I said." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know why I did it. It wasn't right." The manager's expression softened, and she placed a hand on the counter. "You're not the first person to feel that way, Ben. But the important thing is that you're recognizing it. It's easy to get caught up in the stress, especially when we're trying to move things along quickly, but it's never an excuse to treat someone poorly." She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." Ben nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had always known that kindness mattered, but somewhere along the way he had forgotten it. In a world that moved so fast, it was easy to lose sight of the things that really mattered, like patience, empathy, and respect. Outside, the old woman continued her walk down the street, feeling a quiet peace settle over her. She had lived a long life, full of ups and downs, and though she had seen her share of unkindness, she had also seen kindness in unexpected places. She didn't know who the man in the hoodie was or why he had stepped in to help, but she knew that she would remember him. People like him, people who stood up for others when it mattered, were rare, and they deserved to be remembered. As she turned the corner, her mind wandered back to the store. She had expected nothing but the usual routine, paying for her groceries, quietly going about her day. But that encounter had been different. She had been treated like a person, not an inconvenience, and though it had only been a small moment in the grand scheme of things, it had meant more to her than she could put into words. For a brief moment, she thought about turning back and thanking the man in the hoodie, but she knew that wouldn't be necessary. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was time for her to move on. She was, after all, just one person in a world full of strangers. But that didn't mean her actions didn't matter. And as she continued on her walk, the sound of her footsteps blending with the rhythm of the busy street, she felt a small flicker of hope. There was still kindness in the world. Maybe, just maybe, it was more common than she had thought. Back inside the store, Ben stood at the counter, the manager still watching him with a quiet understanding. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to fix what had happened. He couldn't take back the words he had said, and he couldn't undo the moment of rudeness that had passed between them. But he could try to be better. He took a deep breath, glancing at the other customers who were now quietly waiting in line. He looked up at the manager, his face a little more determined. "I think I need to go talk to her," he said. "I need to apologize." "It's the least I can do." The manager smiled, nodding approvingly. "That's a good step, Ben. Just remember, it's not about making everything right in one go. It's about showing up and doing the right thing when you can." Ben nodded, his heart pounding a little faster now. He wasn't sure if the old woman would still be around, but he knew he had to try. Maybe she wouldn't accept his apology, and maybe she would, but he had to do it for her, for himself. He grabbed his jacket from the back and walked toward the door, stepping out into the bright sunlight. The street was busy, but he didn't see the old woman immediately. He scanned the crowd, his heart racing a little faster with each passing second, and then, just as he thought he might miss her, he saw her in the distance walking slowly down the street, her shoulders slightly hunched with the weight of the years but her pace steady. "Excuse me," Ben called out, taking a few quick steps toward her. She turned, surprised to hear someone calling her name. "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry," Ben said, his voice earnest, "for what I said back there. It was wrong and I shouldn't have treated you that way." The old woman paused for a moment, her eyes studying him. For a brief second, Ben thought she might turn and walk away, but then she smiled. A small, knowing smile that seemed to say more than words ever could. "It's all right, dear," she said softly. "We all have our moments. The important thing is that you're trying." Ben stood there, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I'll do better," he promised, his voice quiet but sincere. She nodded once more, and then with a final smile, she turned and continued on her way. Ben watched her go, a feeling of quiet resolution settling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would never forget that day, and he would make sure to remember the lesson he had learned. The days that followed were quiet ones for Ben, filled with the usual rhythm of the store. But something had changed, something subtle but undeniable. Each day as he worked behind the register, he couldn't shake the memory of that moment with the old woman, or the words the man in the hoodie had said. He had apologized, and that had been the right thing to do. But it wasn't enough. He realized now that it wasn't just about making amends for a single moment. It was about changing how he saw people, how he treated them, every day. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. There were still moments when he felt rushed, moments when customers irritated him with their small mistakes or slow movements. But now, when those moments came, he remembered the old woman's face, the quiet dignity she had shown despite his rudeness, and the man's calm words that had shaken him to his core. One morning, about a week after the incident, Ben was standing by the counter when he saw someone new walking into the store. It was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, dressed in a faded hoodie carrying a small backpack. He seemed out of place, his movements a little hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he belonged. As he approached the register, Ben glanced up from his work. He had a vague sense of déjà vu. "Can I help you?" Ben asked, his voice a little warmer than usual. He realized that he had asked the same question 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different. The young man seemed unsure, glancing around the store as though trying to decide what to do. He didn't have a shopping cart, just a few small items in his hands, a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, and a can of soup. Yeah," he said quietly. "I just need to pay for these." Ben nodded, reaching for the register. "All right, no problem." As he scanned the items, the young man hesitated again, glancing at the counter where a sign displayed the store's policy on using cash. It was one of those small details that most customers never paid attention to, but Ben noticed the young man's discomfort. He could see it in the way his fingers clutched the items, the way his gaze flickered between the counter and the door. Ben finished scanning the items and looked up at the young man. "That'll be $8.75, he said. The young man nodded but didn't immediately reach for his wallet. Instead, he looked down, his face flushed slightly. There was something about him, an unease that Ben couldn't quite place. After a moment, the young man spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I only have cash and I'm not sure if I can pay the full amount. Do you take small change? I only have quarters. Ben glanced at the small pile of coins the young man had pulled from his pocket. There were a lot of quarters, maybe more than enough to cover the cost. He could feel the familiar irritation rising in him, but then, just as quickly, he remembered the feeling that had come over him when he had seen the old woman struggling with her change, the frustration he had felt, the way he had made her feel small. He took a deep breath and pushed aside the judgment that had started to bubble up. It's all right, Ben said, smiling. We can work with that. Take your time. The young man's eyes widened, clearly surprised by the response. Oh, thanks, he said, his voice soft with relief. Ben watched as the young man began to carefully count out the quarters, each coin clinking softly as he placed them on the counter. There was something about the way he handled the coins with a kind of quiet determination that reminded Ben of the old woman from the week before. He realized now that the young man wasn't just fumbling for change. He was doing his best, trying not to draw attention to the fact that he didn't have enough. Ben stayed patient, watching the coins pile up, and after a few moments, the young man had counted out exactly the right amount. Here you go, he said, looking up at Ben with a nervous smile. I think that's everything. Ben took the coins and counted them quickly, then looked up at the young man. Yep, that's perfect, he said, sliding the receipt toward him. You're all set. The young man blinked in surprise again, and then a wide grin spread across his face. Thanks so much, he said, his voice full of genuine gratitude. He grabbed his items and turned to leave, but not before offering a final, sincere smile. As the door closed behind him, Ben felt a warm sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the change or the amount of money. It was about treating people with respect no matter how small the transaction. It was about making someone feel valued. And for the first time in a long time, Ben felt like he was doing something right. The store continued its usual pace. People came in and out, some in a rush, others lingering over their purchases. Ben greeted them with a new sense of understanding, his patience growing with each encounter. He started to notice things he hadn't before. The way some customers looked a little unsure of themselves. The way others hesitated before handing over their cards or coins, as though they were worried about being judged. He realized how often he had been quick to judge others in the past. He had always thought it was just a part of the job, something everyone did. But now he saw it differently. Every person who walked through the door had a story. Some were simple, others were complicated, but all of them were worth listening to. It wasn't long before he began to make a habit of reaching out to those who seemed a little uncertain. Whether it was offering a gentle word of reassurance, taking a little extra time to explain a promotion, or simply giving someone the space they needed to feel comfortable, Ben started to realize just how much a small gesture could mean to someone. And then, one afternoon as he was ringing up a customer, he heard the familiar jingle of the door opening, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Ben glanced up and saw her again, the old woman from the other week. She was standing just inside the door, looking around the store, her eyes scanning the shelves. At first, Ben wasn't sure if she had seen him, but then she looked up and their eyes met. Her gaze was steady, kind, and for a moment there was a strange kind of connection between them. She didn't seem as though she was in any hurry. In fact, she looked a little more at ease than last time. Good afternoon, Ben said with a smile, trying to keep his tone warm but casual. The old woman smiled back, her face softening. Good afternoon, she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was something new in the way she spoke, something less guarded. She moved to the counter slowly, just like the first time. This time, however, Ben was ready. He didn't rush her. He didn't give her the impatient sigh or the frustrated glance. Instead, he welcomed her as he would any other customer, without judgment, without hurry. As she placed her items on the counter, just a few simple groceries, Ben made small talk, asking her about her day, about how the weather had been, things that didn't matter much but made her feel like more than just a transaction. She responded in kind, and for a few minutes, they shared a simple conversation, one of those everyday exchanges that can sometimes mean more than the biggest gestures. When the total came up, the old woman reached into her purse and began to pull out coins just like last time. Ben didn't hesitate. He simply watched her, waiting patiently as she counted. When she was done, he smiled and told her that it was no problem, that he would help her with the change. As she handed him the last of the coins, she looked up at him. "Thank you, young man," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "You've been kind. I can see it." Ben didn't quite know how to respond, but he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't a grand gesture or a big moment, it was just a quiet connection. But it meant more to him than any of the words he had said before. He nodded. The days rolled on, and for Ben, life at the store became something different. It wasn't just about ringing up items or processing transactions anymore. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and with them, new opportunities to make someone feel seen. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of stress, times when customers were impatient or demanding. But Ben had started to realize something important. Every interaction, no matter how small, was a chance to make a difference. One afternoon, as he was finishing up a shift, the manager walked over with a look that Ben hadn't seen before. She was smiling, but there was a bit of excitement in her eyes. "Ben, can you come with me for a minute?" she asked, her voice a little more upbeat than usual. Ben was curious, wondering if he had done something wrong. Had he made another mistake? He followed her to the back office, his heart pounding a little faster than normal. When they entered the small office, the manager closed the door behind them. She motioned for him to take a seat. "Relax, Ben, you're not in trouble," she said with a chuckle. "Actually, it's the opposite. We've had some feedback from customers, and I want to show you something." Ben sat down, still unsure what was going on. The manager turned her computer screen toward him, and there on the page were several messages from customers. At first, it looked like the usual feedback, the typical complaints about long lines or prices. But then he noticed something different. These weren't complaints. They were thank you messages. "Ben, we've been getting some really positive comments about your attitude recently," the manager explained. "Some customers have noticed a change in the way you interact with them. They've said you're more patient, more understanding, and that you take the time to make them feel comfortable. It's really standing out." Ben blinked in surprise. He had never expected to see anything like this. In all his time working at the store, he'd only ever seen feedback about how fast or efficient the staff was. But this was different. The manager continued. "This one here," she said, pointing to one particular comment, "says that you went out of your way to help an elderly woman with her groceries last week. And another one mentions how you made a young guy with only coins feel like he wasn't a burden." Ben felt a warm flush spread across his face. He hadn't thought anyone had noticed. He hadn't done it for praise or recognition. But reading those words now, he realized how much of an impact his small gestures had made. The change he'd tried to make in himself was not only visible to him, but to the people he served every day. "I didn't even know anyone was paying attention," Ben said, his voice quiet with disbelief. "You'd be surprised," the manager replied with a grin. "People notice when you treat them with kindness. It's not just about the job, Ben. It's about how you make people feel." Ben sat back, taking it all in. He had come to work that day thinking about nothing more than getting through the shift. But now it felt like he had been a part of something bigger. He had been so focused on the small changes within himself that he hadn't realized they were reaching out and touching the people around him. As the conversation wound down, the manager looked at him with a new kind of respect. "I wanted to show you these because I think it's important to recognize how far you've come. Not just in the way you interact with people, but in the way you see the world. It's made a difference here. Keep it up, Ben." Ben nodded, the words sinking in deeper than he could express. He had made mistakes in the past, sure. There had been days when his patience had worn thin, when he had judged people too quickly. But now he could see how far a little understanding could go. He wasn't perfect, no one was. But he had started something. And it felt good. It felt right. Later that evening, as Ben walked out of the store and into the cool night air, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The world around him felt the same as always. Cars passing by, people walking quickly to their destinations. But for him, something had shifted. He had learned that life wasn't just about the things you could see. It was about how you made people feel in those fleeting moments. The old woman, the young man with the coins, those were more than just random encounters. They were lessons. They had taught him how to see the people behind the transactions, the lives behind the purchases. As he walked toward his apartment, He thought about how different things had been just a few weeks ago. He had been a person who rushed through the days, caught up in his own thoughts and frustrations. But now, every encounter felt a little more meaningful, a little more connected. The next morning, as Ben opened the door to the store, he was greeted by a familiar face. It was the old woman from the other week. She was standing in the doorway, a small bag of groceries in her hand. When she saw him, she smiled and waved. "Good morning, young man," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I just wanted to thank you again for your kindness the other day. It meant a lot to me." Ben smiled, feeling the familiar warmth in his chest. He wasn't sure why she had come in today, but he was glad to see her. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "It was nothing. I just wanted to help." The old woman shook her head gently. "No, it wasn't nothing. It was kindness, and it's rare. People don't always take the time to be kind, you know?" Ben nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. I'm trying to do better." The old woman's smile deepened, and for a moment they just stood there, sharing a simple, silent understanding. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. As she turned to leave, Ben called out to her. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "You too, Ben," she replied. "And remember, kindness goes a long way. Don't forget that." Ben watched her leave the store, and as he did, something clicked. She wasn't just offering words of encouragement. She was reminding him of something he'd already learned. Kindness was simple. It was small actions, little moments that added up over time. But it was also powerful. Later that day, the man in the hoodie came in again. Ben recognized him immediately, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Neither of them said anything, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. The man smiled, just the smallest of smiles, before heading over to the shelves. As Ben worked through the day, he kept the old woman's words in his mind. Kindness went a long way. It wasn't just about doing good for others, it was about how it made the world feel a little brighter, a little warmer. Even when the days were long or the customers were tough, Ben knew that it was the little things that mattered most. And when the day finally ended, and Ben locked up the store, he walked out into the night air with a quiet smile on his face. The world outside still felt busy, still felt fast, but Ben knew now that he was part of something bigger, something that had the power to change not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Kindness, he realized, wasn't just a one-time act. It was a way of being. It was something you carried with you always. And that was the most important thing he had learned.